my pleasure to be here to speak to you about X-linked adrenoleukodystrophy. Feel free to ask any questions that may arise from my presentation. X-linked adrenoleukodystrophy, or ALD, affects the nervous system, white matter, adrenal cortex, and testis. There's a childhood cerebral form, adult spastic paresis form, and Addison-only form, and they often occur in the same family, thus the same mutation in the gene. There's an accumulation of saturated very long-chain fatty acids due to impaired oxidation of very long-chain fatty acids that are oxidized in the peroxisome. And it results from mutations in the ABCD1 gene that codes for a peroxisomal membrane protein that is part of the ATP binding cassette transporter superfamily. In 1923, it was recognized in the literature and published by Zimmerling and Creutzfeldt. It was described as bronzed Schilder's disease. The bronze refers to the darkened skin that these boys have because of Addison's disease. In 1976, the very long-chain fatty acid excess was found in brain and adrenal cholesterol esters by Powers, Schomburg, Suzuki, and Igarashi, who were at Albert Einstein in New York. And in 1976, the adult form of the disease, adrenomyeloneuropathy, was recognized. In 1981, we developed the plasma total lipid very long-chain fatty acids, and thus were able to identify many, many boys and men and women carriers with the disease. However, I screened the mice at the Jackson labs looking for a model for ALD, and I did not find any mice with increased plasma very long-chain fatty acids. So in 1981, the gene was mapped to XQ28, and in 1990, the first successful bone marrow transplant was done on the childhood cerebral form by Patrick Aubourg in Paris. So the 1993, the ABCD1 gene was cloned by Patrick Aubourg and Mendel in Strasbourg. In 1997, the mouse model was developed by Kirby Smith and his graduate students, and we looked at the plasma, total lipid very long-chain fatty acids, in that mouse and found that they were normal. However, there was a 5-fold increase in total lipid C26 in all tissues. But once we developed the assay for newborn screening in 2006, we found that the mouse had increased C26 lysophosphatidylcholine in plasma and tissues. Thus, there was a new marker for evaluating therapies in the ABCD1 mouse. Here's the chromatogram that shows the very long-chain fatty acid excess in the fatty acid methyl esters of brain cholesterol esters. And the story is that the Dr. Igarashi left the instrument on too long to clean the instrument overnight. Ordinarily, he would have stopped the assay around the middle of the chromatogram, but he came in the next morning and saw this increase of very long-chain fatty acids only in the samples from ALD. So the ALD gene maps to the chromosome XQ28, codes for 745 amino acid peroxisomal membrane protein. The ALD protein is called ALDP, or the ABCD1 protein, and it belongs to the human protein family of the ATP binding cassette transporters. ALDP is in the subfamily D and member 1, Thus, it's called the ABCD1 gene. There are over 2,475 mutations in the gene that cause ALD, of which 748 are non-recurrent. And this number keeps growing, and it's growing by leaps and bounds now that ALD Newborn Screening has started in the large states of California and New York. There's no correlation with the phenotype. And mutation analysis is essential for accurate heterozygote detection. Now, write down this website if you're interested in ALD, because it has a wealth of information, not only about the genes, but also the biochemistry, the history, therapies, newborn screening, and it's translated into 4 languages. So it's a very important website for families and physicians and health professionals. The ALD phenotypes and the relative frequency. There's the cerebral form, which affects between 35 and 40%, which is a diffuse inflammatory demyelination with rapid progression. It's a childhood form, onset 4 to 8 years, and that's the most common form. Then it's less common, I should say, than the adult form, which is affecting 40 to 45% of all ALD. The adult form is a distal axonopathy, mainly in spinal cord, and it causes paraparesis in young men, adults, and progresses over decades. It's a miserable disease, and for which we currently don't have good therapies. Then there's the Addison disease only, affecting 20 to 30% at onset. However, most will develop AMN, the adult form, later. These phenotypes frequently occur in the same family. And 50% of heterozygote women, and the Dutch say 80%, will develop adrenal myeloneuropathy in middle age or later. So it does affect women, but usually postmenopausal. Here's the adult form. The clinical findings are spastic paraparesis, ataxia, sensory dysfunction, bladder dysfunction, distal muscle atrophy, dark skin because of Addison's, thin hair, we don't understand that yet, and they may or may not have adrenal insufficiency. The childhood cerebral form of ALD affects 35% of the total ALD population, always male. The onset before 10 years, the earliest is 2.75 years, with a peak of 7 years for the first symptom. Initial symptoms resemble attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. They may respond to stimulants used for ADHD, and the progression to apparent vegetative state is 1.9 plus or minus 2 years. So it's a rapid cerebral progression. The childhood form of ALD most commonly has adrenal insufficiency, about 85%. However, it's found perhaps by biochemical testing, therefore stress tests for adrenal function are very important. The MRI abnormality, that is the brain scan abnormality, precedes the clinical findings. And the clinical findings, I'm not going to show the MRIs. I don't really understand them that well, so I'm not going to show them. However, 65% of parieto-occipital, 15% of frontal, 15% of projection fibers, and 5% are atypical. Here are the treatment outcomes in the childhood cerebral ALD. We measure, or the pediatric neurologist and radiologist measure the MRI severity rating, and we call it the LESS score, which was established by the neuroradiologist Dan Less. He's still in Minnesota, and he still reads a lot of MRIs from ALD boys. So the LESS score of 0.5 is considered normal and no neurological involvement. The LESS score of 8 to 9 is recommendation for gene therapy or hematopoietic stem cell therapy. Greater than 8 or 9, not usually recommended for HSCT or gene therapy. And then the pediatric neurologist also measures the neurological function score, and then there's an ALD disability rating score. All these tests are done to measure the disease status. At least 5 included outcome studies with an N=6 that compare pre and post HCT outcomes between early versus late stage childhood cerebral ALD with MRI severity LESS scores. Here are the references, and the bottom line is that they say the earlier the intervention, that is, the earlier the transplant for a child with progressive cerebral disease, the better the outcome. And here are the Kaplan-Meier curves. The top curve shows those boys who had a good outcome with a LESS score of less than 8, and compared to the outcomes for those boys on the lower curve that were detected with a LESS score greater or than 9. Adrenal insufficiency can also cause death. So about 80% of males with ALD have adrenal insufficiency. It's rare in ALD carriers. One study describes how diagnosis of adrenal insufficiency can help speed the diagnosis of ALD and help improve outcomes. The hematopoietic stem cell transplant does not affect the adrenal, doesn't cure the adrenal insufficiency. So those boys who have had bone marrow transplant will also have to be continuing on their meds for Addison's disease or adrenal insufficiency. Adrenal insufficiency, we tell all pediatric and adult endocrine physicians that if they have a male with Addison's disease, they should also screen that male for ALD, because 50% of males with Addison's disease only have ALD as the cause of that Addison's. So presymptomatic identification of adrenal insufficiency in ALD males saves lives. Bone marrow transplant improves outcomes, and treatment with a lower LESS score is associated with better outcomes. The recommendation, once we identify a boy with ALD, and he should have an MRI every 6 months from the age of 1.5 years to 10 years, and then after 10 years annually. If that MRI shows brain abnormalities that are progressive, that boy is referred for transplant. We have done studies of families, and And now that we have newborn screening for ALD, leads to improved survival in late childhood compared to detection after the development of neurological symptoms. There's also Lorenzo's oil, and many of you remember the movie. Lorenzo's oil is a therapy. It's a dietary therapy that reduces the very long-chain fatty acids in the blood. However, there's no beneficial effect in the childhood or adult cerebral form once the symptoms start. In an open-label preventative study without control cohort, I might add, the risk for cerebral disease was reduced by 60% in asymptomatic boys who normalized their very long-chain fatty acids compared to those who did not normalize their very long-chain fatty acids in blood. Currently, it's only available through FDA Expanded Access Program in the USA. The FDA does not approve it, so it's not available to every physician. We're working on that to try to make it more available. So the purpose of ALD newborn screening is to identify males with ALD, to prevent overt adrenal insufficiency, reduce the risk of childhood cerebral phenotype with Lorenzo's oil diet, improve the prognosis of cerebral ALD by facilitating early bone marrow transplant or gene transplant, and to improve success of future therapies. To identify 80% of ALD heterozygotes, the newborn screening does not identify 100% of the female carriers. Only gene analysis would be nearly 100%. To provide family screening for male ALD relatives. And I can tell you a short story here. There was a little girl who was born in the state of New York, was found to be an ALD carrier. Her mom had just moved to New York, and just within a few months before she was born. So she was identified because they had ALD newborn screening in New York. So her grand uncle had been having back problems for years and didn't know why he had this back problem. And he had had multiple surgeries which didn't help. So he was found to have the adult form of ALD. He is eternally grateful that his grandniece was born in the state of New York, and he has become one of our big advocates for ALD newborn screening. He travels around state to state. He would be here today if it weren't for the distance traveling. He's in a wheelchair. So, diagnosis, we also diagnose the peroxisome biogenesis disorders and other peroxisomal very long chain fatty acid disorders. And really there's no good therapy for these disorders. However, it helps prevent the diagnostic odyssey, and it provides genetic counseling and supportive therapy. So here's the minimum birth frequency of ALD in the United States. And these are numbers that we obtained by putting together several laboratories who screened for ALD, and they reported their numbers, and then we also added the numbers that our laboratory had identified through family screening. So we calculated that the hemizygotes in the male population are 1 in 21,000, or the total population is about 1 in 42,000. And you add to that the female population, and you get an incidence of 1 in 16,800. And similar results were obtained in France and Canada. So here's the history of development of the newborn screening test for ALD. In 2004, we met with the newborn screening people at NIH, and my husband insisted that we add ALD to the list of disorders. However, there was no test available that could be done in the newborn blood spot. We couldn't change the way blood was collected on newborns and measure plasma, very long-chain fatty acid. That was really the only test at the time. So we developed this new test in 2006 that could be used on the whole blood spot. And we found 5 to 10-fold increases of C26 lysophosphatidylcholine in ALD dried blood spots. These were postnatal blood spots that we made in our laboratory. And then we actually spent $25,000 to have the internal standard custom synthesized by the Avanti Polylipid Lab. And in 2009, we validated the test using newborn blood spots that we retrieved from the state of California and the state of Michigan. And in 2013, we did an ALD newborn screening pilot study of 5,000 in Maryland. However, we didn't find one positive, but that was only 5,000. So we said, well, we have a low false positive rate. And in December 2013, the New York State, using the marker of C26 Lyso-PC, added ALD newborn screening for ALD. And as of July 2017, and 820,000 screened, the birth incidence of ALD is 1 in 15,472. So that's close to the number that we predicted. In August 2015, after many trips to NIH to meet with the Secretary's Advisory Committee, they voted to add ALD to the recommended uniform screening panel, the RUSP. Here for the lab people, these are the MSMS fragmentation patterns of the C26 Lyso-PC and its internal standard, which is a 4-deuterium labeled C26 Lyso-PC. And we measure the 104 ion. And here are the measurements in blood spots showing there's a good separation between normals and ALD newborn blood spots and ALD postnatal blood spots. And you can see that the ALD heterozygote values overlap that with normal values somewhat, but we believe we can detect about 80% of the female carriers. And then the peroxisome biogenesis disorders have, these are postnatal samples. They have higher levels than the postnatal ALD samples. So our test, the LCMSMS C26 Lyso-PC newborn screening test, it identifies the following peroxisomal disorders: X-linked adrenoleukodystrophy, which is genetically inherited and affects 1 in 16,800 births. It's more severe in males, and there are 3 phenotypes: the childhood cerebral phenotype, and the adult form, the adrenal myeloneuropathy phenotype, and ALD with Addison disease only. And the test also identifies 80% of ALD carriers, and the peroxisome biogenesis disorders, or they're now called the Zellweger spectrum disorders, and the single enzyme defects of peroxisomal fatty acid oxidation. So these are rarer. So I cannot stress the importance of the family groups in lobbying for ALD newborn screening. So lobbying in New York by Elise Seeger. She went before the legislature body in New York and got ALD added to the New York newborn screening. And Elise, through her organization called Iden's Law, Elise has gone to practically every state in the union to lobby for ALD newborn screening. So Minnesota, New Jersey, Connecticut, Georgia, DC, Maryland, California, Texas, Illinois, Florida, Pennsylvania, Nebraska, and Massachusetts, all of these have legislative approval to add ALD newborn screening. And the lobbying continues in many, many other states. And I know that this list is incomplete because I know of, there was a surprise when I learned that Georgia had added ALD newborn screening only last month. And in August of 2015, the recommendation was to add ALD newborn screening to the RUSP. So here's the update on ALD newborn screening in New York, thanks to Elise Seeger and Iden's Law. They started screening at the end of December 2013. Connecticut started screening in October 2015. And California started in September 2016, but they had to screen all those babies that were born once ALD had been added to the RUSP. So they had this backlog, and you can imagine how large that is in the state of California. Minnesota and Pennsylvania added ALD to their newborn screening panels several months ago, and Georgia recently implemented, and Washington, D.C. will start this fall. Here is the New York State result, and I have permission to give you this update. They do the screening along with the screening for the lysosomal disorder, Krabbe disease, in their first tier. They combine ALD with the product of the enzyme analysis of Krabbe disease. And they do it through a high throughput test, and thus they have a high percentage of ALD identified through that high throughput test, because there are some isobaric contaminants for the C26 Lyso-PC that need to be separated out by doing LC-MS, which is the tier 2 in New York. And I might add that smaller states like Connecticut skip that high throughput tier 1, and they just do the screening by LC-MS. Thus, they don't have this very high positive rate that they have to deal with. So New York cuts down the numbers by doing this HPLC and MSMS for the C26 lysophosphatidylcholine, and their detection is 0.009% of the total. Then they do a third tier test, which is to look at the ABCD1 gene and sequence the entire gene to look for mutations. So before they report that this baby has ALD, they do the ABCD1 mutation. And if that baby does not have a mutation in ABCD1, then they work up the baby for a possible peroxisome biogenesis disorder, or a large, they would also miss very large deletions in the ABCD1 gene. So very often we end up in our laboratory helping New York identify that babies diagnosis by analyzing all the peroxisomal functions in blood. So their confirmed status as of July is 27 males with ABCD1 mutation, 26 females carriers, and all ALD calculates at 1 in 15,472. They also identified 9 other peroxisome biogenesis disorders or single enzyme defects, which gives an incidence of 1 in 91,000. So you can see it's much rarer than ALD. Then by chance, they found an Aicardi-Gouttiere syndrome baby who was in a NICU because she was severely affected at birth, and they had sent her sample to Gene DX, and they had found that she had Aicardi-Gouttiere. So here we had another sort of false positive, but we've just published a paper describing why that is. So the referral rate in New York is 1 in 13,000 births, or 0.008% of infants screened. The incidence of ALD is 1 in 30,000 males. The total incidence of males and females is 1 in 15,472. The incidence of the peroxisomal biogenesis disorders is 1 in 91,000. And the prediction of ALD had been, using family screening, was 1 in 17,000 to 1 in 20,000 births. So ALD, again, to reiterate, started recently in Georgia and is coming soon to Washington, D.C., New Jersey, Washington State, Missouri, Nebraska, and Illinois. Those are the ones I know about. And I might add that CTX, which is cerebrotendinous xanthochromatosis, a treatable disease of bile acid metabolism. They're doing a screening in Israel where it's highly prevalent because of founder effects. So we'll see if that is one of the next recommended disorders to be added to the RUSP. Michael Gelb in the state of Washington has begun a pilot study. I call this a neurological screen. He's combining the screening for several inherited neurological disorders, including CTX, MLD, which is metachromatic leukodystrophy, NPA, which is Niemann-Pick A, and Niemann-Pick C, and CRAB-A. And he's doing it 90,000 newborns anonymously, born in the state of Washington. And one of the ideas behind his screening is, number one, that he can do it as a combined screening, and number two is to find out what is the incidence of these disorders, because CTX, we do not know the incidence in the U.S. We know the incidence in high prevalent countries where it's highly prevalent, like Israel and the Mediterranean area. So the current therapies for ALD is to assess adrenal function in the newborn period and every 6 months, and adrenal hormone replacement if found to be deficient. I might say that in New York there was a male baby born who was found to have a mutation and was confirmed ALD. He also had a heart defect and he needed surgery. So they did adrenal stress tests in that baby and found that he had an abnormal stress test for adrenal function. So they were able to give him stress doses of adrenal hormones before that heart operation, and we believe that that helped improve the outcome of that surgery. Then Lorenzo's oil therapy, beginning at 6 months through 10 years, which is shown to be preventive of brain disease if the very long-chain fatty acids are normalized in blood. And then follow with brain scans, MRI, every 6 months, and if abnormal and progressive, refer for bone marrow transplantation if there is a matched sibling donor or a matched umbilical cell transplant, or if there's no match, we can now refer for ABCD1 gene therapy. And ABCD1 gene therapy is done similar to a bone marrow transplant. They take the bone marrow from the ALD boy, they transfect it with the gene for ALD, and then give that give the bone marrow with the gene back to the ALD boy, and that's how it's done. And they've done more than 30 in this country, and Bluebird Bio is the proponent for doing these gene therapy transplants in the U.S. and around the world, and they're trying to get FDA approval now for that procedure. So many boys with ALD are being followed at the Moser Center for Leukodystrophies at the Kennedy Krieger Institute, and other leukodystrophies obviously are referred here, and there is a multidisciplinary clinic with all of these therapies available. So the acknowledgements are many. This took an enormous effort over the years. And these are the people who made ALD Newborn Screening possible. And I wish to thank them all. And we also had funding from the United Leukodystrophy Foundation, from ELA, the European Leukodystrophy Association, the Myelin Project, Run for ALD, Brian's Hope, Stop ALD, and we also had some government support, NIH support, and wish to thank everybody for their attention.